So let's think a bit more about where God might be. And I'm indebted to this book by Paula Gooder called Heaven, which describes and goes through lots of the biblical assumptions and ideas about heaven. So there's many things to say. First is that really up until Jesus' time, or really just before Jesus' time, the idea that people who died went to heaven didn't really exist. There were a few people, maybe Abraham, Methuselah, Elijah, who went to dwell with God. The very righteous, the very good, but everybody else went down to Sheol, went down to a land below. Well, for most of Jewish history, people just disappeared. Actually, there was no life going on. And then there came this idea that maybe some people carried on living, and then there must be a place for them. But it was a bit like sleep. And then it was only very much later that an idea about a resurrection came. And even then it was, well, maybe at the end times when, God comes back to judge the earth, and maybe the dead will rise and be with them, be with God there. And then, of course, with Jesus, our ideas become that actually when we die, we go to be where Jesus is, because our Christianity is about being united with Jesus. We get united with him in baptism, and we identify with him, and then we participate in his death and resurrection when we take communion, when we take the bread and the wine. And so what happens to Jesus happens to us. So Jesus ascends into heaven, so we ascend with him and are where he is. And so then the idea that actually heaven is a place where the dead go, the dead in Christ go, and that because heaven is somehow outside of time, our normal understanding of time, they're there already. They don't have to wait until the end of time. But you'll see in Thessalonians and in Revelation different understandings of those timings and of what happens to people when they die. Especially because the early church thought that Jesus was going to come back any day, and so it didn't really matter if the dead were asleep for a week or a year. Now we're up to 2,000 years and we're thinking, well, are they still just sleeping? How is that working? In Revelation, that amazing picture of the people under the altar going, how much longer, Lord? How much longer before we can rise up again? And so this idea of heaven, for most of the Bible, is not a place where the dead go. The idea of heaven, as originally created, is that earth was a place that God made for humans to dwell. Earth, here we are. But that God wanted to be close to his creation. So he made, but he found that difficult. They found it difficult to be with him. It wasn't quite possible for whatever unknown laws of spiritual physics. And so God made heaven as a place for him to dwell, with a great marble sapphire floor and all these other things. A place for him to dwell, to be as close as possible to humans. It's fantastic, isn't it? So heaven is this place where he can be ever so close, and he can just look through a little window and be, oh look, you're there. And this idea is expanded in the idea of the temple, where God kind of dwells, where his footstool dwells, his feet come down, or he sits on the cherubim and seraphim above the Ark of the Covenant in the temple in Jerusalem. So that's the point where heaven and earth touch in Jerusalem. And then the exile comes and people are taken away from Jerusalem. So they've lost contact with God. But then there's Ezekiel's vision of a rolling chariot, this throne with wheels. It's amazing. We might call it a wheelchair, but you've got to think bigger than that. Wheels within wheels. What Ezekiel is describing is a way that God can come to his people. He can leave that point in Jerusalem and he can come and be with his people. And then in Isaiah it says, raise up a highway, flatten the hills, raise up the valleys, so that this throne chariot can race out to wherever we are and see his people coming back on this road, this highway of holiness that leads to where God is. And then all of that is superseded in Jesus, because Jesus becomes the temple. Jesus becomes the link between heaven and earth. And so that's how we get to heaven. So heaven, this idea that God is very, very close to us, as close as he can be. And it's a place for him to dwell, not for us. And then later, as we understand that we are in Jesus and that Jesus goes to heaven, where God dwells, then we are taken into that place too. Although, and all of that is lovely and good, and you can back it up biblically, as Paula Gooder does, I also have this feeling that heaven is a place where God dwells and the angelic beings dwell, the angels and people with him, and serve him, and there's lots of worship. But some of the views in Revelation and elsewhere make you feel that this heaven, this earth, will be renewed. It won't be swept away and be useless. This, like when we become Christians, we're not swept away and made useless. We are renewed from within, a new creation from within. So why won't that happen to our earth? That it will be renewed. And actually, I'd quite like to spend my next life, whatever this next thing is, I'd like to spend it gardening and working and making this earth beautiful. I mean, why wouldn't we want to work? We're made to work. We get great satisfaction from working. And so why wouldn't we use those skills? Why wouldn't we live in a redeemed earth? You know, so that actually the afterlife is not about sitting around on clouds. The afterlife is about beekeeping or bookkeeping or filmmaking or accounting or cooking or all these things, but doing them without any kind of sin, any kind of fault, any kind of things that get in the way, so that we could do them amazingly. I mean, I quite like that idea of what happens when we die. So, yeah, there you go. Heaven, earth, God is there, God is here. And it's a mystery what happens when we die. But in Jesus, that changed things quite fundamentally spiritually, that suddenly there was a hope for a life after this one. And that is our hope, that all will be redeemed one day. Amen.